Hi everyone, today we're here to talk about functional contextualism, which is the philosophical worldview that underlies contextual behavioural science, as well as models of therapy like acceptance and commitment therapy. So let's go. So sometimes clinicians tend to zone out a little bit when we start talking about philosophy or philosophical worldviews, and because it can sound as though it's going to be pretty dry or uninteresting, but it's really relevant to have a good understanding of your philosophical assumptions. And one of the reasons for that is that you already have assumptions that you carry into the therapy room anyway. So your assumptions are going to be pushing you around, really whether you're aware of them or not. So one of the nice things about really becoming aware of your philosophical assumptions is that they can't kind of push you around outside of your awareness. You can kind of choose them. So having an understanding of these sort of philosophical worldviews, you can also kind of choose which ones maybe you might want to adopt in the therapy room as well. So you can make a conscious choice to adopt the assumptions of functional contextualism, or you might choose to kind of adopt another set of assumptions. But being kind of open and transparent about what your assumptions are just kind of puts you in a position where they're not going to be pushing you around outside of your awareness. So we're here to look at the worldview of functional contextualism. The whole notion of philosophical worldviews was first brought about by Stephen C. Pepper in his 1942 book, World Hypotheses, A Study in Evidence. And he kind of identified 4 philosophical worldviews. And he wasn't particularly writing about science or psychology or clinical work or anything like that. He just identified 4 worldviews, which are ways that we can kind of come to understand and think about and study the world or the universe. And one of those views was contextualism. So each of these worldviews has a root metaphor and a truth criterion. And the root metaphor of a worldview is just a really common sense, everyday analogy that we can use as a way of kind of understanding the world. And in contextualism, the root metaphor is the act in context. So we look at the act in context as a whole organism interacting with a situational and historical context. So what does that mean? So if you think about, I'm engaging in a behavior at the moment, which is I'm sitting here and I'm talking into a camera. If we kind of put that act in context, I mean, that act kind of has a purpose. We can't really just look at one piece of that act and have it sort of make sense as a full psychological act. I have a purpose in sitting here and talking to the camera. And we can even broaden that out and say, well, why is it important for me to be doing this? Because I'm interested in this work, or I want to share this work. Why was it important for me to become interested in the work? Or why was it important for me to share it in this way? We can kind of broaden out the context and see that there is actually kind of a big historical context that sort of surrounds this particular act. And even your behavior right now is an act in context. You're sitting somewhere kind of watching this video, and that's happening in a situational context wherever you are, in your home or at work. And again, there's a historical context around that as to why it was important for you to be watching this video, what's kind of guiding your purpose in that direction. So this is what happens when we kind of put an act in context, simply speaking. The other kind of piece of a worldview is the truth criterion, which is basically just how we determine whether or not our analyses are valid. And in contextualism, the truth criterion is successful working. So we say that any kind of action or endeavor is true or valid if it results in successful achievement of a particular goal. So that's the kind of root metaphor and truth criterion of contextualism. And this is just one stance. It's just one philosophical stance you can take towards behavior. When we make these assumptions, they're kind of pre-analytic assumptions. So we can't really say that these assumptions are sort of universally right or wrong or better than other assumptions. If you take that particular stance towards behavior, it leads you to look at behavior in a certain way and ask certain questions of behavior, which is different to the sorts of questions you might ask if you took another stance towards behavior. So we look at behavior as an act in context. Other philosophical stances might be curious to look at the kind of underlying or internal causes of behavior, the kind of brain neural circuits or neurochemistry that kind of underlies behavior. That's not the kinds of questions we're asking in contextualism, but it's just one stance that you kind of can adopt. And when that stance was kind of originally proposed, as I said, it wasn't really written for science or psychology. So Steve Hayes and some of his colleagues came about many years later and sort of said that if we're going to adopt contextualism and use it in psychology, that there were a couple of kind of changes that needed to be made. So looking at an act in context, we also need to look at what is our goal for putting an act in context. And you can have a lot of different kind of goals for putting an act in context. You might have the goal of doing that just say in order to appreciate all of the factors that might be influencing a behavior. So there's a kind of contextualism called descriptive contextualism. And the goal there is to put an act in context simply so you can appreciate and have a greater understanding of the factors that are influencing that. So you might look at something, history is a good example of descriptive contextualism. You might look at, say, World War II, and you could explore all of the different contextual factors that might have kind of, impacted or led to the events that happened in World War II. And in psychology, though, and in clinical work, we're kind of wanting to put an act in context, but not just so that we can appreciate it. We're actually looking to be able to do something with people's behavior. When we're sitting in the therapy room, we're working with our clients. We're not just trying to appreciate their behavior in a full contextual view. We want to be able to predict and influence that behavior so that we can kind of help them to move it in more meaningful directions. So Hayes and his colleagues stipulated really clearly that the goal of their form of contextualism was to better be able to predict and influence behavior with precision, scope, and depth. So it differentiated functional contextualism from contextualism. The second way that they differentiated functional contextualism was with the truth criteria. As I said, Pepper's truth criteria was that any kind of action is true or valid if it results in successful working, which is great, but if you think about it, really all behavior results in successful working in one way or another. Like all behavior achieves or accomplishes some kind of goal. But again, in psychology and in clinical work, we're not just interested in successful working towards any goal. We want for our goals to be more purposeful and more meaningful. So Hayes and his colleagues made the stipulation that yes, we can use successful working, but it has to be towards something. And towards what? Towards an explicitly stated verbal goal that has to kind of be there before the analysis is kind of done. So that's the kind of basis of functional contextualism. It's putting the act in context for the purpose of better being able to predict and influence that, and how successful we are at predicting and influencing that in a particular direction, which is of importance to the client that we're working with, is how we determine the workability of the analysis. So even though we can't say that any particular philosophical worldview is kind of right or wrong or true or better or worse than any others, we can certainly talk about how it's useful to adopt different kinds of postures in the therapy room. So I find functional contextualism to be a really kind of useful stance to adopt in the therapy room for quite a few different reasons. So the first reason really is that it's a very innately curious stance to adopt in the therapy room. So if you think about that kind of core assumption of the act in context, that we can't understand behavior unless we can really sort of see the contextual elements that are influencing it, it means that when we see behavior in the therapy room, straight away it kind of puts us into a state of curiosity, that we kind of want to know what are the situational kind of pieces of the context that are pushing that behavior around? What are the historical aspects of the context that are showing up to push it around? So it puts the therapist in an immediately kind of curious space, rather than seeing a behavior and kind of wanting to categorize it or think about what diagnostic category does it belong to, or judging it as being kind of right or wrong or normal or abnormal. We immediately are kind of positioned in a state of curiosity. Functional contextualism is also, I think, an innately empathic or compassionate approach to therapy as well, because we're really assuming that the client's behavior always makes sense. So really, with their kind of situation that they're in, and with their personal histories and with their personal kind of goals and preferences and values, their behavior will make sense to achieve a given outcome in a particular situation. So it's kind of taking a really non-pathologizing sort of stance towards behavior, where we're really just kind of getting curious and assuming that it makes sense. And if it doesn't make sense, we're not kind of putting that back on the client and assuming that that's because there's something wrong with them. It's just because we haven't kind of identified the relevant sort of contextual factors that we need to be able to see to be able to understand how that behavior is working for that client. The other reason that it's a nice philosophy to hold in the therapy room is that it is a very individualized philosophy to take. So putting an act in context and looking at how it's working starts at the level of the individual. We have to look at their situational context, their historical context. So we're not talking about kind of averages or looking at how people might behave on average who have these problems. We're looking at how this individual is behaving and their personal kind of histories. So, and given that clinical psychology in general is moving towards quite individual sort of approaches, and even in health in general, the approaches of kind of precision medicine or personalized medicine, it's really nice to have a philosophy in the therapy room that lets you work in really individualized kinds of ways. The other reason that it's a great philosophy to hold is because the criteria around successful working, as we said, we're successfully kind of trying to work towards a client's particular goals or their particular values. So even in the philosophy itself, we've kind of got this kind of constant reminder that keeps orienting us back to, is what I'm doing helping me move the client towards their particular personal goals based on their personal values. So the philosophy continually orients us back to that kind of definition of workability. So it's kind of a great philosophy to hold for a number of reasons in the room. So if you're interested in any of these ideas, or if you find any of this stuff relevant to your clinical work, feel free to check out my website or Facebook page for other videos and resources, or sign up to the mailing list. And keep an eye out for workshops that we might be running, where we really look at practical ways of kind of using these philosophies and these ideas in the therapy room with your clients. Thanks for watching.